Morning, everyone. So now we'll go on to the keynote. So I'd like to announce Nicole Denil from Microsoft. Nicole is the director of the Americas ISV program for Microsoft, and she's going to share her thoughts on cloud computing, and I think you'll find it a great presentation. So here's Nicole.
Thank you. Thanks. Thanks, Vlad. Okay, my mic's working. I heard that Tom was a really funny presenter last night, so he set the bar very high. I can't promise to be too funny, but I hope to be engaging. So if I see anybody falling asleep, I might shout out to come on stage. So no sleeping, despite the late night last night. Did anybody win any money? Did anybody lose any money? I'm trying to decide what my night's going to be like, so I'm looking at the odds. So I wanted to chat a little bit about cloud computing. The reason that I'm here, actually, is that Ektron recently announced its beta for the Azure Edition. There are 3 key tenets for what Azure enables in this edition, which are marketing agility, hybrid deployment, and dynamic elasticity. And I'm hoping to talk about why cloud is important to enabling these 3 things. Just to get an idea of the audience, how many developers do we have out here? Wow, huge group of developers. How many marketers? How many IT folks? Great, so we have a good mix. Any other that I missed? Silence. Okay, so I'm going to run a little bit through what the cloud computing landscape looks like and why it's important today and what businesses are trying to achieve. I'll talk about the Windows Azure Platform, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about business value, because none of this makes any sense if it doesn't translate into business value. So what we're seeing today is that a lot of companies, especially in the economic climate, are trying to figure out, hey, how do I remain competitive in a space that's being completely inundated by new competitors every day, especially with things like cloud that enable new competitors to emerge. How do I stay focused on my core business and get out of the business of running IT? How do I reduce my costs so that I can stay competitive or just have a bigger top line, better ROI? How do I do that without managing data centers? A lot of what we're hearing is that end users and ISVs, or cloud service vendors, are looking at ways that they can get out of the business of maintaining data centers and having heavy IT. It's somewhat equivalent to back in the day when manufacturers would build their own power generation facilities. Nobody does it anymore. They rent or lease energy from the energy company. A lot of companies are focusing on how to maintain security. With the internet, firewalls and things are constantly proliferated, and the edge continues to grow. So security is really important. And then, of course, embracing globalization. As we look at how companies are expanding their business, globalization is a key piece, and that's hard to do when you're running data centers. So those are sort of the drivers behind why cloud computing and why now. So cloud computing, what it really does in a nutshell is delivers IT in a way that frees you up to focus on your core business. So when we talk about cloud computing, there are a lot of different terms that people throw out there that I'd like to kind of just do some level setting with. There's software as a service, which has been out there for a while, right? Salesforce.com was one that started delivering CRM as a service. Hotmail, Gmail, all of the different things that you can go out and just basically pay per usage or free as a service, right? So software as a service is something that's been around for a while. And then if you look at the very bottom, infrastructure as a service is something that most companies know as well. It's the alternative to running your own data center. Hey, I'm going to go down the street and lease some space from a hosting provider. Platform as a service is really sort of the newer area that is part of cloud computing, and that's really what I'm going to talk about in the Azure context, is platform as a service. So let me skip that slide here. So the Windows Azure Platform is the platform as a service that we're going to be talking about. And then Ektron's release for Azure is actually the software as a service that runs on the platform. So So here are some of the customers today that are using the Azure platform, and I'm going to talk about some of the specific cases where they saw some of the benefits from using platform as a service. But one of the key pieces is one of our customers said, hey, what used to take 2 months to set up can now be done in only 1 week. I know that the Ektron Azure release has severely, or I guess not severely, but has decreased the deployment time in a very large way. And so I want to talk about that a little bit as well. So some of the key characteristics of cloud computing in general are, hey, it's service delivered on demand. I use it when I need it, and when I don't need it, I don't pay for it, which is a key difference from hosting or hosting on premise. Typically, you have to set up servers to be able to handle your peak capacity. With service on demand, you just use it when you need it. Broad network access, being able to access from anywhere in the world your services. Shared pool of resources. Hey, why do I have to have dedicated servers to do something when I could share with others in order to maximize the benefit? It supports elastic demand. A lot of our customers use cloud for this, and I'll talk about that in just a second. And then again, it's a metered service. It's much more like paying for electricity than paying for a physical server. So I think some of you will recognize this life cycle here. So let's say that you need to deploy a marketing website that's going to be seasonal. You've got a bunch of things that you need to do. You need networking, storage, servers, virtualization potentially, the OS, database, middleware, and then your runtime, right, which is the application itself. So you think that you need a web server and maybe a database. But then you quickly realize that you need a load balancer, you need redundancy, so you're going to set up everything that you need to guarantee your SLA. Wait a minute, you actually really need this, right? You need backup, you need restore capabilities, you need more than just a load balancer, and pretty soon you've got this on-premise world that is very expensive and hard to maintain. And then as you grow, you're constantly facing, peaking demand. You need to figure out, hey, how do I grow with my business, right? And pretty soon you've got a whole spaghetti of resources that are going to become obsolete in 3 years. You've got to replace them. So cloud computing says, no, this is not the way to go. We need to do it differently. So the easiest way to boil down what the difference is with cloud computing versus on-prem or hosted is to think about what you manage. So if you look over here on the left, what you see in blue is what you manage in an on-premise environment. In the middle tier here, the managed hosting, what's in blue is what you manage if you lease space from a hoster. Let's say a Rackspace or Amazon, they provide the networking, the storage, the servers, and even up to the OS. But you're going to manage the rest of it. You're going to install your database, you're going to do your patching, you're going to do your security, you're going to set up your load balancers, your replication. And then if you look at infrastructure as a service, it's very similar, right? Where you're just actually leasing the physical piece, and then you have to manage the OS, the databases, everything above. And then as you look at platform as a service, everything is managed for you. So under the sheets, in an environment like Azure, we take care of the networking, the storage, the servers, the OS, the patching, security, load balancing, the whole works. And you only manage the apps and the data. So I'll talk about how that works. So this is a cycle that a lot of you probably recognize as well. Using that same, hey, I've got to launch this seasonal campaign, what I'm going to do is set up a server. So the black line there represents the physical world. So you set up a server, as you start to monitor your load. Oh, it looks like I'm going to start to see some peaking. So I've got initially some wasted capacity because I just launched my product or my campaign. Then I'm going to monitor it and I see, uh-oh, my website went down because I got a massive amount of hits. Then you start to put on more servers, so those little steps there represent more servers. And eventually you have a fixed cost of IT capacity that you've just installed or rented from a hosting provider. In the Azure view, your actual capacity matches the demand exactly, right? That's the whole idea of elasticity, where you reduce your initial investment until you actually flip the switch to turn it on. There's nothing happening. You're not paying for it. You reduce your oversupply. You have no undersupply because it's going to grow and expand as you need it to. And then you have the potential reduction in IT capacity once your campaign starts to die off. So that's the whole idea behind Azure. So when we look at what kind of workload patterns our customers are encountering, that I'm sure that all of you have seen a combination of one or all of these. There's the on and off, right? So this is a great example is a seasonal campaign. We're working with one of the large providers of online tax reporting. I won't mention who it is because it's not released yet, but they see this every year where they've got to ramp up a whole boatload of servers in order to meet tax season, and then when they're done, they need to redeploy those. So that's a scenario of the on and off. The growing fast scenario, hey, I'm going to launch a new product or a campaign and I'm not sure what the uptake is going to be. One of the recent examples that we had here was that we have a company that we work with called Thuzy that does Facebook campaigns. So they did a couple of Facebook campaigns with, one of them was Outback Steakhouse, where they wanted to launch a campaign around a blooming onion, where you could send your friends a coupon on Facebook for a blooming onion, and they weren't sure, is this going to take off, is it not going to take off? Well, it took off wildly, and they were able to accommodate the demand for that. Another one was an Under Armour campaign that was also a Facebook campaign. So those types of campaigns and anything that's going to grow fast, you're not sure what the uptake is, a great scenario for cloud. Unpredictable bursting. So one of the cases that we've seen with unpredictable bursting is Kelley Blue Book. When the Cash for Clunkers program was launched, guess what everybody did? They went out to Kelley Blue Book to see what their car was worth. And it took down all of their on-premise servers. They had 26 on-premise servers, and they came to us and said, hey, we want to flip all of our extra traffic up into the cloud. So when we reach a certain amount of capacity on our physical servers, we're going to flip that extra load up into Azure. So they replicated their environment in Azure and flipped it there. Eventually they said, hey, this is ridiculous. Why are we even maintaining physical servers? And they went 100% to Azure. But that was an example of unpredictable bursting that the cloud is good to accommodate. Predictable bursting. Some of the scenarios that we've seen here are, for example, Domino's Pizza. They've got a predictable burst that happens every Friday and Saturday night. They actually plan for their peak, right? So they've got on-premise servers they had on-premise servers that actually are there for their Friday, Saturday demand. And then Super Bowl Sunday, they see unpredictable bursting where everybody at halftime starts to order pizzas, and it goes up to maybe 30, 40 times their traditional Saturday, Sunday demand. So again, they initially engage with us to handle the burst scenario, but then once you start to see how this works in a fluctuating environment, it becomes very cost compelling. So what is Windows Azure under the sheets? Because I've talked a lot about cloud computing and the benefits, but under the sheets, what you really have is a platform as a service that's comprised of two main components, Windows Azure and SQL Azure. So think of Windows Azure being your compute environment and your storage environment, and SQL Azure being your relational database environment. So those are two pieces that interrelate to each other, as well as on-premise. So one of the really great things about this platform is that it talks you to a hybrid environment. So for example, you could have Windows Azure running an app out in the cloud and talk to an on-premise database, or vice versa. In fact, with the Ektron Azure release, it's a hybrid environment where they've got the actual websites that you would deploy running out in the Windows Azure and SQL Azure environment in the cloud, but there's the local client that you're used to that allows you to sync those two pieces. So under the sheets, again, those two main components, there's also a service bus component that allows you to secure data as it flows from an on-prem environment to the cloud. So when you're thinking about how you use the eSync functionality, when it actually goes out to the cloud, you can secure that through the service bus environment. So I just want to talk a little bit about how we do this, right? Because under the sheets, obviously, cloud computing is a physical environment in a real physical world. We have data centers throughout the world that are all geographically replicated. So let's say that you're in North America and you deploy your website to one of our data centers in North America. That will automatically be replicated into another data center in North America. So you basically set your geographic location and then everything takes care of itself from there. So we've got data centers throughout the world. What do these things look like, actually, right? If you go to, for example, our Chicago data center where we do tours, you'll see that it's about 8 football fields long, full of actual containers, like shipping containers that you might see driving down the street one day. And they've got a bunch of servers and racks, and they back them up into the data center. We hook up networking, cooling, and electricity, and in about 4 hours, you're up and running. So our providers actually build those to spec, and we just basically plug them in, which allows us to constantly be adding capacity as needed. So it's, in theory, massively scalable. In theory, there's no limit because we can just keep on adding. Obviously, there are physical limits within that 4-hour range that it takes us to set up new containers. So I mentioned this a little bit as far as the power of choice. One of the things that's important with cloud computing is that not everybody is going to move today everything to the cloud. It's going to take a long time for that to happen, and especially with concerns about security, compliance, just fear about, hey, I don't want my data to be living outside of my control where I can actually physically see it and control it. So under the sheets, because of the way that Azure is constructed, the same things that we use in our own on-premise platform, which is Windows Server, Hyper-V, SQL Server, all of the key platform components are the same ones that are used in the cloud. They're just managed for you versus you having to manage them yourself. So what that enables is lots of different scenarios around hybrid where I mentioned, hey, the Ektron client is sitting on your desktop, but then when you deploy it actually goes out into the cloud, which is where you really want it to be massively scalable and replicated and make sure that it's never going to go down. So the world of on-premise, hosted by Microsoft, which would be Windows Azure, or hosted by a hosting partner, those are all 3 scenarios that sort of plug and play together in this hybrid environment. So eSync is actually able to plug and play in all of those different environments, and you have the choice then of where do I actually want to deploy my website? Do I want it to sit on my physical server? Do I want it to sit on a hosted server? Or do I want to have it sitting in Azure? I talked a little bit about security. A lot of the concerns that people have are, hey, I am used to controlling my environment. How does Microsoft actually deal with security? So we've got physical security where we comply with the ISO standards, there's one other one that I can't remember the name of it, but basically SAS 70. SAS 70 type 2 compliance. We've got logical security. Data centers are geo-replicated. We've got compliance and certification. So what it would actually take for any company to go do this, to provide this same level of security on their own, would not be cost effective to the degree that we've got this running. I was actually shocked during my first data center tour of Chicago that there were 3 Microsoft full-time employees running that entire data center. And the key manager of that data center gave us a tour for 2 hours without ever having a cell phone or beepers or anything go off. That's the level of security and compliance that helps this stuff run seamlessly without having to have a lot of human intervention. So really, the key value props around cloud, and especially pertaining to the content management world, are, hey, I want to be able to innovate quickly, right? I don't want to have to go to IT and ask them to spin up servers for me. And a lot of times IT has bigger and better priorities than the campaign that you might want to run, or at least to them it's bigger and better priorities. Although for you, if it's something that you want to run in a seasonal way, or hit the holidays, or need to get that out by a certain date, of course that's the highest priority. And it's hard to take people off of sort of keeping the lights running mode to rededicate to to spinning up servers for that. So innovating quickly is probably the key scenario that we see here. Growing the business, no matter where you're starting from. A lot of companies that we work with are taking their core IP, things that they've been able to monetize over the years, and spinning them into a SaaS type of environment where they can expand globally or expand into different market segments. So we see a lot of companies that traditionally served enterprise, they take that same core IP and boil it down into a SaaS environment so they can go after the SMB market. So remonetizing existing IP is a big one. Or even starting up brand new revenue streams. We've got a customer in Canada that launched a SaaS product that was completely outside of their traditional business, and now it's their core business in about 6 months. So scaling reliably and cost effectively to demand. Oops, I don't know why that's happening. Sorry about that. So one of my favorite stories is a company out of Argentina that was called 3 Melons. And they launched a game for Facebook called Bola, which was a World Cup soccer game where you could actually go out and construct your team and get sponsors like Coca-Cola or Pepsi or Nike to sponsor your virtual team. And when they started to engage with me, I thought, you know, this has a chance to either succeed or fail very quickly, one or the other, right? And so they decided to go with Azure. It was 10 people, young guys in a garage, trying to launch this. In about 2 weeks, they went from using two virtual instances to 250 because it grew so fast. They launched it right before the World Cup. And within 6 months, they were acquired by a company called Playdom out of California that is the largest Facebook and MySpace game provider. And then Playdom was acquired by Disney about 6 months after that. So these 10 people in a garage are now Disney Online Games employees that sold their IP for a very large sum of money due to the fact that they were able to do all these things, innovate quickly with no cost until they were ready to launch as far as the infrastructure goes, growing their business no matter where they were starting from, which was 0, and then being able to scale. One of the big pieces for them was, you know, demand growing and shrinking when people were online playing and as more people ramped up onto the game. So I wanted to put out here as well, we talked a lot about the business benefits as far as innovating and being able to start new businesses. But when it comes to just, hey, you know, I just want to look at a standard website that I might put on Azure, I might consider doing on-premise. This is sort of a typical one. You're going to see lots of variations in what the savings would be. But we did an analysis to say, okay, we've got this website whose pattern is unpredictable bursting. We want to look at the cost of ownership comparison within either hosting on-premise or hosting with a third party. And so it was $3.2K to host it on-premise, and then with Windows Azure Platform, it was $266 a month. So those are monthly figures right there. So pretty drastic savings when it comes to these types of patterns. There are certain patterns that aren't great for cloud. Let's say that you've got 3 servers that are sitting there running a workload at 70% capacity for 3 years, and it's never going to change. It's probably not going to be that cost effective necessarily to move it to the cloud unless you're up for refreshing those servers. But in these types of scenarios, especially online marketing scenarios and websites, it's very, very compelling. So I included a slide here so that you guys could go out and check out the actual use cases of Azure. And I also then just wanted to open it up for questions. And I put my email address here as well so that if you want to email me after the fact, I'm very open to that. And I will also be at the cocktail. I'll just say that tonight. So I'd like to open it to questions. I see one here in the back. I think they've got some mics that they're taking around.
Hi. What about other traditional managed hosting services like intrusion detection, URL monitoring? Are those things that are partners that provide, or are those available from Microsoft as well?
So I think what I cut out in the first portion. So I think what you asked is, what about being able to monitor the service? Is that?
Traditional managed hosting services like URL monitoring, intrusion detection,
right.
that you get from providers that do have physical environments, is the same available from Windows or through Azure in some way?
Got it, yep. So we actually do provide some monitoring tools right with the Windows Azure Platform, but we do have, most of that is actually provided by third-party partners. But we have very rich monitoring capabilities, not only of the Azure service itself, but the ability to actually monitor website traffic and the URLs and all of that as well. Question here? Great question. So the question was how, in a traditional environment, you've got testing and staging environments. How does that work in the Azure world? Within Azure, there are actually two environments that are identical, which is you've got a staging environment where you do all of your development and testing, and then once it's ready to go, you literally push a button and it rolls over to production. So it's the exact same environment, which is great because you don't have to then worry about parity of the environments because that's all done under the sheets. It's actually the same servers under the sheets, but it's just a matter of rolling it over into a public type of environment, public domain. Question here.
What's the main difference between what Amazon's offering and Windows Azure?
Great question. So I had, in the very beginning, I talked about on-premise hosting, and then I talked about infrastructure as a service, and then I talked about platform as a service. The key difference between what Amazon provides and what Azure is that Amazon is more of an infrastructure as a service where you basically pick your virtualized world, right? And you sort of draw a box around it and say, I'm gonna rent 5 VMs from them. And then you install the OS, you're responsible for patching it, you're responsible for maintaining it. And those are your servers, right? You're drawing a box around what you want. With Azure, all that's taken care of under the sheets so that when you deploy an app, you're literally deploying it into a virtual environment that you don't necessarily need to know or care about in terms of how many servers am I using. There are ways to set it up to auto scale. So that's really the key difference, is that it's infrastructure as a service versus platform as a service. Two questions here.
In terms of applications development, how much constraints do we have in developing Windows Azure and SQL Azure compared to the traditional development?
Sorry, the first part of the question was?
In terms of applications development, in .NET, for example, how much constraints do we have in the Azure platform compared to the traditional development?
Yeah, so the Windows Azure platform, typically people think of it as being sort of a .NET environment just because, Microsoft is .NET, and we have, within Visual Studios, we have sort of a local cloud that you can write and test against, and then actually onboard onto Azure. But we actually support any language that Windows Server 2008 supports. So Java, Ruby on Rails, Python, anything that you could do in a traditional Windows server is supported with Azure.
Yeah, a few years back in the book, Does IT Matter? One of the parallels drawn was moving from electricity produced within a factory to utility electricity being the same as what we're talking about today. And the point was that ultimately you go from a strategic advantage to something that you have to manage as more of a risk. Do you find that as people adopt Azure, they need to sort of retool their internal IT teams, their tools themselves, to change how we deliver our services back to our business customers? So how do the departments adapt as they start adopting Azure?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, was that Nicholas Carr, the book? I'm not sure. So there have been a lot of parallels drawn between Azure as sort of a utility model, or cloud computing as a utility model, and the utility model that is the paradigm of moving from building your own power generation to moving to an electric service that somebody else provides. So what does that mean in terms of the change internally within an organization? There are key people that are affected, and all of you are actually in this room. Marketers obviously don't have to then go ask for servers to be spun up, right? That's a key thing. Developers deploy directly to the Azure environment, so they're going to do things very similar to how they did it in the past, with some architectural differences, right? Instead of saying, hey, I want this app to point to that physical SQL server there, your connection string is going to actually point to a SQL Azure instance in the cloud. So there are key architectural changes, not so much code changes, but architectural changes that need to take place. And then as far as the IT staff goes, there are some key changes there as well. There's, it kind of takes the IT staff out of the mundane things like setting up servers every time they need setting up and taking down and setting up and taking down and patching and dealing with all the security breaches, and allows them to focus really on the core things that the company needs to own on premise, and then also it's much more of, like I said, an architectural discussion where the IT folks are thinking about where things live. Okay, I've got maybe I've got my on-premise SQL server here that's going to replicate to SQL Azure in the cloud because I want to maintain a local copy for maybe latency purposes, but I want to have a replica in the cloud to serve customers that are across the globe. So there's lots of architectural things that need to be thought about when you're looking at moving to the cloud, and those are really kind of the key changes per role that happen when the move to the cloud is made. Question here.
Is it possible to pick and choose some of the services on the platform, for example, swap out CDN with Akamai?
Yes, it is. So good question, whether or not you can swap out certain services for others. And the example here was the CDN potentially not using our CDN but using Akamai, which I actually didn't even talk about the CDN. We have a CDN that has 24 nodes around the world so that you can cache local copies of pages and things that need to be accessed every day, or videos, or whatever it is that you're putting out there. We have within the Windows Azure environment, there's a concept of blob storage, which actually store your stuff in blob storage and then replicate it out to the CDNs. But the answer to that question is yes, it's a totally open environment in terms of hybrid scenarios and referencing other services. You could use just the service bus if you wanted to transfer data from one on-prem location to another on-prem location, or from on-prem to the cloud. Or you could have the database sitting on-prem and the service that you want to be expandable and contractible or scalable sitting out in the cloud, but maybe you're not comfortable putting the data out there. So it's a very mix and match hybrid environment, and CDN is one of those components as well. Question here.
Hi. How does it work with Active Directory and single sign-on?
How does it work with Active Directory and single sign-on? So there was a component there that I did not go into detail on, but it's part of the Windows Azure piece of the two different pieces, that actually the service bus is part of the Windows Azure piece. And we have a whole identity and access management capability built in that allows you to federate Active Directory into the cloud. So you could use single sign-on. Question again over here. The question was, what's the name of the component that allows you to replicate data? So we've got a couple of different things that allow that. So there's, within the Windows Azure platform itself, if you decide that you're going to put data into storage, for example, let's say that you've got videos, we will already under the sheets replicate that data in multiple locations. So that if an instance over here goes down, we just pull up another one over here and your data is safe, right? That's sort of under the sheets. We also, with SQL Azure, have a data sync capability that allows you to replicate data in a relational database from over here to another one over here in the cloud, or on-prem to cloud, which is a scenario that a lot of customers use because they want to have a backup and they don't want to set up another physical environment to have backup, so they'll replicate their physical environment to the cloud. And that's data sync. And then there's, I think the component that you might be talking about is the service bus that allows you to encrypt data as it flows from on-prem to cloud or cloud to on-prem. Oh, okay, yeah, so that is part of the service bus component as well. Any other questions? Great, so I'll be at the cocktail tonight, so if anybody wants to chat a little bit more about Windows Azure, I would be happy to do that. Thanks very much for having me.